What if I told you that the worst thing that ever happened to you was the most necessary thing for your psychological development? That your deepest pain, your most devastating loss, your most crushing failure wasn't a mistake of the universe, but a precise psychological requirement for becoming who you're meant to be? Carl Jung spent 50 years studying the human psyche and made a discovery that will completely change how you see suffering. He found two types of pain in life: the suffering that destroys you and the suffering that creates you. Most people can't tell the difference, so they fight against the experiences that could transform them into their most authentic selves. I will show Jung's revolutionary framework for distinguishing necessary suffering from unnecessary suffering, and give you the exact integration practices he developed to turn your deepest wounds into your greatest strengths. Jung's personal journey. Carl Jung didn't develop his theory of necessary suffering from an academic ivory tower. He discovered it during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of psychological crisis that nearly destroyed him but ultimately became the foundation of his life's work. In 1913, at age 38, Jung was at the peak of his career. He was Freud's chosen successor, internationally respected and financially successful. Then everything fell apart. His relationship with Freud ended bitterly. His professional reputation was in ruins, and he began experiencing what he described as a stream of fantasies that made him question his sanity. For 6 years, Jung descended into his nekia, a journey into the underworld of his psyche. He experienced visions, heard voices, and felt like he was losing his grip on reality. Most people would have seen this as pure pathology, something to be medicated or suppressed. But Jung made a radical choice. Instead of fighting these experiences, he decided to engage with them. He began active imagination, deliberately dialoguing with the figures and images emerging from his unconscious. He recorded everything in what became known as the Red Book, a leather-bound journal filled with his visions, drawings, and psychological insights. What Jung discovered during this period changed psychology forever. He realized that his psychological breakdown wasn't a malfunction. His psyche attempted to integrate parts of himself he had rejected or ignored. The suffering wasn't random. It was purposeful. It was his unconscious mind forcing him to confront aspects of his personality that needed to be acknowledged and integrated. This experience led Jung to understand that certain types of suffering aren't obstacles to psychological development. They are psychological development. The pain isn't something to be avoided. It's the mechanism through which the psyche reorganizes itself into a more complete, authentic whole. The architecture of necessary suffering. Understanding the two types of suffering. Jung distinguished between neurotic suffering and necessary suffering. Understanding this distinction is crucial because it determines whether your pain becomes a source of growth or stagnation. Neurotic suffering, the pain that destroys. Neurotic suffering is pain that serves no developmental purpose. It's the suffering we create through our resistance to reality, our attachment to outcomes we can't control, and our refusal to accept what is. Jung writes, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. This type of suffering includes ruminating endlessly about past events you can't change, anxiety about future scenarios you can't control, comparing yourself to others and feeling inadequate, staying in situations that consistently violate your values, refusing to grieve losses and instead staying stuck in denial or anger." Neurotic suffering is characterized by repetition without resolution. You experience the same emotional patterns over and over without any growth or insight. Suffering keeps you small, stuck, and disconnected from your authentic self. Necessary suffering. the pain that creates. On the other hand, necessary suffering is pain that serves a developmental purpose. The suffering emerges when your current psychological structure is inadequate for your next growth stage. Jung called this legitimate suffering because it's the price of psychological evolution. This type of suffering includes the grief of losing someone or something that defined your identity, the anxiety of stepping into unknown territory that aligns with your values, the discomfort of confronting aspects of yourself you've denied or rejected, the pain of outgrowing relationships, careers, or belief systems that no longer serve you, the struggle of integrating conflicting parts of your personality. Necessary suffering is characterized by movement toward wholeness. Even though it's painful, it leads to greater self-awareness, authenticity, and psychological integration. The suffering makes you larger, more complete, and more genuinely yourself. The individuation process. Why suffering is essential. Jung's concept of necessary suffering is intimately connected to what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, rather than who you think you should be or others expect you to be. Individuation requires confronting and integrating what Jung called the shadow, the parts of yourself you've rejected, denied, or hidden. This process is inherently painful because it means acknowledging aspects of yourself that contradict your self-image. For example, if you've always seen yourself as the good person, individuation might require you to acknowledge your capacity for selfishness, anger, or cruelty. If you've identified as the strong one, you might need to integrate your vulnerability and need for support. If you've been the rational person, you might need to embrace your emotional and intuitive sides. This integration process is what Jung meant by necessary suffering. The pain isn't punishment, it's the psychological labor required to become whole. Just as physical growth sometimes involves the discomfort of stretching muscles and bones, psychological growth consists of the discomfort of stretching your sense of self to include previously rejected aspects. The shadow integration process. Let me show you how this works practically. Jung discovered that the shadow, the rejected aspects of our personality, doesn't disappear when we ignore it. Instead, it gets projected onto other people or situations, creating external conflicts that mirror our internal conflicts. For instance, if you've rejected your anger, you might be constantly surrounded by angry people who trigger you. If you've denied your neediness, you might be attracted to needy partners whom you resent. If you've suppressed your ambition, you might be critical of ambitious people who remind you of what you've disowned in yourself. The necessary suffering comes when life forces you to recognize these projections and reclaim the disowned parts of yourself. This might happen through crisis and breakdown. Sometimes life circumstances force shadow integration. A career failure might force you to confront your incompetence or vulnerability. A relationship ending might force you to acknowledge your contribution to the problems. Repetitive patterns. If you keep experiencing the same types of conflicts or attracting the same kinds of problematic people, your psyche is trying to show you something about yourself that you haven't yet integrated. Dreams and fantasies. Jung believed that dreams often present us with shadow figures, characters who embody the qualities we've rejected in ourselves. Paying attention to these figures and what they represent can guide the integration process. Projection recognition. When you have a strong emotional reaction to someone else's behavior, especially if it's disproportionate to the situation, it often indicates a projection. The qualities that most trigger you in others are usually qualities you haven't accepted in yourself. The transcendent function. Jung discovered that something remarkable happens when you consciously engage with necessary suffering instead of avoiding it. He called this the Transcendent Function, the psyche's ability to create a new level of consciousness that includes and transcends previous limitations. The Transcendent Function works through what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Instead of choosing one side of a psychological conflict and rejecting the other, you learn to hold both sides simultaneously until a new solution emerges. For example, instead of seeing yourself as either good or bad, you learn to hold the tension between your capacity for kindness and cruelty, creating a more nuanced and realistic self-understanding. Instead of being independent or dependent, you develop the capacity for healthy interdependence. This process is inherently uncomfortable because it requires you to live with uncertainty and contradiction. However, Jung found that this discomfort is the birthplace of psychological creativity and growth. Distinguishing necessary from unnecessary suffering. Now that you understand the theory, let me give you Jung's practical framework for distinguishing necessary suffering from unnecessary suffering. The 4 questions of discernment. When you're experiencing pain or difficulty, ask yourself these 4 questions Jung developed. Question 1. Is this suffering moving me toward greater wholeness or keeping me fragmented? Necessary suffering integrates previously split-off parts of yourself. It makes you more complete, even if it's temporarily uncomfortable. Unnecessary suffering keeps you stuck in the same patterns, often by avoiding aspects of yourself or your situation that need attention. For example, the grief of losing a parent is a necessary suffering because it forces you to integrate the reality of mortality and develop a more mature relationship with life and death. But ruminating for years about how the death shouldn't have happened is unnecessary suffering that prevents integration and growth. Question 2. Is this suffering teaching me something essential about myself or reality? Necessary suffering always contains information. It reveals something about your values, limits, unconscious patterns, or the nature of reality that you need to understand. Unnecessary suffering is repetitive and doesn't yield new insights. The anxiety of starting a new business might be necessary suffering because it teaches you about your relationship with risk, uncertainty, and capabilities. But the anxiety of constantly worrying about worst-case scenarios you have no control over is unnecessary suffering that doesn't provide helpful information. Question 3. Am I fighting against reality or working with it? Necessary suffering involves accepting what it is while taking appropriate action. Unnecessary suffering consists of fighting against circumstances you can't change or refusing to take action where you do have influence. The pain of ending a relationship that no longer serves either person is necessary suffering because it accepts the reality of growth and change. But staying in a destructive relationship because you can't take that person's change is unnecessary suffering. Question 4. Is this suffering connected to my authentic development or maintaining a false self? Necessary suffering often emerges when your authentic self tries to emerge, but conflicts with the persona or false self you've constructed. Unnecessary suffering usually comes from trying to maintain an image or identity that isn't genuinely you. The discomfort of speaking your truth, even when it's unpopular, might be necessary suffering because it serves your authenticity. But the anxiety of constantly trying to please everyone and maintain a perfect image is unnecessary suffering that serves a false self. The integration practices. Jung developed specific practices for working with necessary suffering that I will share now. These aren't techniques for eliminating pain. They're methods for extracting the psychological gold hidden within difficult experiences. Practice 1. Active imagination. When you're experiencing necessary suffering, Jung recommended engaging with it through active imagination. This involves personifying the suffering or the psychological conflict and having a conscious dialogue. Here's how to do it. Find a quiet space and close your eyes. Allow an image to emerge that represents your current suffering or conflict. Engage this image in dialogue. Ask it questions. What do you want from me? What are you trying to teach me? What part of me do you represent? Listen to the emerging responses, even if they seem strange or unexpected. Continue the dialogue until you've received some insight or understanding. This practice helps you move from being a victim of your suffering to having a conscious relationship with it. Practice 2, shadow dialogue. When your suffering seems connected to conflicts with other people, use Jung's shadow dialogue technique. Identify the person or type of person who most triggers you. List the qualities in them that you find most objectionable. Ask yourself, how might I possess these same qualities, even in a small way? Instead of rejecting these qualities, explore how they might serve you if integrated consciously. Practice expressing these qualities in healthy, conscious ways. For example, if you're triggered by selfish people, explore how developing healthy selfishness might serve your growth and relationships. Practice 3, the tension-holding exercise. When you're caught between conflicting desires or values, use this practice. Clearly define both sides of the conflict. Instead of choosing one side, consciously hold both in your awareness. Notice the discomfort of not resolving the tension immediately. Stay with this discomfort and observe what new insights or solutions emerge. Allow a third option to arise that honors both sides of the conflict. This practice develops what Jung called psychological flexibility, the ability to hold complexity without premature closure. Modern applications and case studies. Let me show you how Jung's framework applies to everyday modern situations. Case Study 1, Career Transition Anxiety. Sarah was a successful lawyer who felt increasingly miserable in her job, but was terrified to leave because of financial security and social expectations. Using Jung's framework, necessary versus unnecessary suffering analysis. Her anxiety about leaving was necessary suffering because it was connected to her authentic development. Her psyche was trying to move her toward work that aligned with her values. Her anxiety about what others would think was unnecessary suffering was based on maintaining a false self. Integration practice. Through active imagination, Sarah dialogued with the part of herself that wanted security and the part that wanted authenticity. She discovered that both parties had valid concerns and developed a transition plan that honored both needs. Result: she gradually transitioned to freelance legal work, focused on causes she cared about, maintaining financial stability while moving toward authenticity. Case Study 2, Relationship Conflict. Mark was constantly angry at his partner's neediness and emotional demands. Using Jung's approach, shadow recognition, Mark realized that his partner's neediness triggered him because he had rejected his own emotional needs and vulnerability. Integration practice. Instead of trying to change his partner, Mark began exploring his disowned neediness through shadow dialogue and active imagination. Result: as Mark integrated his emotional needs, his anger toward his partner decreased, and their relationship became more intimate and authentic. Case Study 3, Midlife Crisis. At 45, Jennifer felt like her life had lost all meaning. Her children were grown, her marriage felt routine, and her career success felt empty. This is a classic example of what Jung called the midlife transition. Understanding the necessary suffering. Jennifer's depression wasn't pathology. It was her psyche's way of forcing her to confront the second half of life, which Jung believed required different values and priorities than the first half. Integration practices. Jennifer used Jung's techniques to explore what she wanted to emerge in this new life phase, including parts of herself she had sacrificed for family and career success. Result: she discovered a passion for art that she had abandoned in her 20s and began integrating creative expression into her life, leading to a renewed sense of purpose and vitality. The neuroscience behind Jung's insights. Modern neuroscience has validated many of Jung's insights about necessary suffering. Research shows that psychological integration, what Jung called individuation, changes brain structure in measurable ways. When you consciously work with difficult emotions instead of avoiding them, you strengthen the connections between your prefrontal cortex and limbic system. This integration allows for better emotional regulation and more flexible responses to stress. Studies on post-traumatic growth show that people who consciously process difficult experiences often develop greater resilience, deeper relationships, and a more meaningful sense of purpose, exactly what Jung predicted would happen through engaging with necessary suffering. Holding tension between opposites, which Jung saw as essential for psychological growth, has increased cognitive flexibility and creative problem-solving abilities. Most importantly, research on meaning-making shows that people who can find purpose in their suffering experience better mental health outcomes than those who either avoid suffering or see it as purely negative. Your integration practice challenge. Here's how to begin applying Jung's framework to your own life. Week 1. Suffering assessment. Identify your current sources of suffering and use Jung's 4 questions to determine which are necessary and unnecessary. Week 2. Shadow work. Choose one person or type of person who consistently triggers you and practice the shadow dialogue technique. Week 3. Active imagination. Engage with one area of necessary suffering through active imagination, seeking to understand what it's trying to teach you. Week 4. Integration. Practice holding the tension of opposites in one area of conflict, allowing a new solution to emerge. Remember Jung's profound insight. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Your necessary suffering isn't your enemy. It's your psyche guiding you toward wholeness. The question isn't whether you'll experience complex emotions and challenging circumstances. You will. The question is whether you'll use Jung's framework to transform that suffering into wisdom, authenticity, and psychological growth. If this video helped you understand the difference between necessary and unnecessary suffering, hit that like button and subscribe for more psychological insights that transform your life. Next week, we're exploring Viktor Frankl's revolutionary approach to finding hope in seemingly hopeless situations. Insights that could change how you see every challenge you face. Comment below and tell me, what's one area of necessary suffering you're ready to engage with using Jung's approach? I read every comment and often feature the most insightful responses in future videos. Remember, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, but it's also the most liberating. Your suffering has something to teach you. Are you ready to listen?